This is the first of two videos we've got about stress. This video concentrates on the nature of stress in English, and the second video has a series of exercises which will help you to get back in touch with your speech breathing, how you produce stress syllables, and hopefully which you'll be able to apply and adapt for your students. Now, all the videos we do have got slides which you can download from in this case, from the Week 2 Wiki website. And the slides have got notes on the right-hand side of the page. So you can either download them if you want to after watching this presentation, or if you like to follow along with the notes while you're watching, you're very welcome to pause this presentation now, download them, and then you can follow along while I'm speaking. There's one issue in terminology or vocabulary which we need to just clarify before we get started. The word stress, even just within the domain of English pronunciation, gets used in two slightly different ways. One is to describe so-called lexical stress. This is the issue about which syllable in a long multisyllabic English word, or which two syllables, will be actually stressed. So there are various tendencies about whether it should be the first from the end of the final syllable, and so on and so forth. And people have come up with rules, and it's an important issue, but it's not something we're going to be dealing with on this course. We're dealing with the other way in which the word stress gets used. It's known as sentence stress. And this is the question about what stress is. What is it that makes a syllable more prominent? What is it about stress that makes a syllable more prominent? Now, there are two perspectives we can take on this. The conventional approach is to say, what are the so-called cues, the so-called acoustic cues to stress? What does a stress syllable sound like? What is it that the listener enables the listener to pick up on the fact that it's a stressed syllable? And when people look at stress from that point of view, they come up with answers like a stressed syllable might be longer, it might be louder, there might be a pitch movement on it, it might be a bit clearer than an unstressed syllable. And in the paradigm of pronunciation teaching, which says that just by imitating the speaker, this is the way to learn pronunciation, then teachers will say things like, well, try and make it louder, try and make it longer. They'll actually focus on these particular acoustic cues to stress and try to get students to copy them from the recordings which they are presenting to them. The alternative approach is to say, well, what is stress? Well, what do speakers do in order to produce a stressed syllable? So not what does it sound like, but what do the native speakers actually do? This is the so-called articulatory approach. This is the approach which we're going to be taking on this course. So the first question is, what is the nature of stress from a production point of view? What are speakers actually doing when they produce a stressed syllable? This is one of the standard books on English pronunciation. It's written by a man called Peter Roach, who's now an emeritus professor of phonetics from Reading University. And writing about the nature of stress, he said the following. I'll read from what he said. Stressed syllables are produced with greater effort than unstressed. And this effort is manifested in the air pressure generated in the lungs for producing the syllable. These effects of stress produce in turn various audible results. And he talks about pitch changes, length changes, loudness changes, and all the things we've been talking about. But his starting point is that the speaker is making more effort, and that effort is realized in heightened pressure within the lungs. So the nature of stress, the underlying nature of stress, according to Peter Roach, is the greater effort being made on the part of the speaker. And this point was made even more forcibly by another phonetician, J.C. Catford, whose book you can see on the screen at the moment. This is a wonderful book. We very highly recommend it. It says in its title an introduction to phonetics, but it's a very good introduction to English pronunciation as well as being an introduction to phonetics. Catford said that stress is initiator power. Now, what he meant by the word initiator was the respiratory system, because it's the respiratory system which starts up the flow of air, and of course it's the flow of air through our vocal folds, into our mouth, over our tongue, etc., which creates the noises which people then interpret and understand to be linguistic sounds. So the initiator is the respiratory system, and Catford said stress is initiator power. So stress is all about what we do with our respiratory systems on a stressed syllable as opposed to being what we do on an unstressed syllable. So how does this work? How can we generate extra power with our respiratory musculature? This is a diagram of the respiratory system, and if we take it from the top downwards, just underneath the man's chin, you can see, in fact in his throat, but it's below the chin in this drawing, you can see the larynx, and inside the larynx there are the vocal folds, which is the principal noise-making machinery for speech. Underneath the larynx and the vocal folds you can see the trachea, or the windpipe, And this is emerging out of the lungs, the two lungs, the left and right lung. Notice that the left lung is a little bit distorted. The two lungs are not entirely symmetric because, of course, the heart is lying on the left-hand side, slightly to the left of the center line of the human body, and that takes up some space from the left lung. So your left lung is a little bit smaller than your right lung. Now, the two lungs are resting on top of the diaphragm, which is the dome-shaped muscle that divides the upper part of the chest wall, the upper part of your thorax, from the lower part of your thorax. The muscle is a dome shape, which gives it some very specific properties, and there are some misconceptions about the action of the diaphragm and whether it helps in what aspects of breathing it helps in and it takes part in. So let's have a look at the diaphragm in a little bit more detail before we look at what the nature of stress is from a speech-breathing perspective. This is another picture of the human body from the front, a more schematic view of what's going on. So what you can see is, you can see in the space in the middle, you can see where the lungs would fit, and then you can see the outline of the diaphragm in its resting position in the middle of the page. And notice again that it's slightly asymmetric. It's got a little dimple slightly on the left-hand side of the center, and this is where the heart is distorting the shape of the diaphragm. So that's the resting position of the diaphragm, and you can see that it's a dome. It's an upward facing curve. In order to inspire, in order to bring air in, the diaphragm creates more space above it. And creating more space above it means the lungs expand and that pulls air into your system. So the diaphragm is an inspiratory muscle, and it can do this because by contracting its fibers in this dome-shaped position, the whole diaphragm flattens. So you can see the diaphragm will move downwards when it flattens, when it contracts. This creates more space above and air flows in. However, muscles can only contract. They can't actively expand themselves. So while the diaphragm can relax and go back to its resting position, if we want to actively reduce the space above the diaphragm in order to push air out of ourselves, to expire actively, something else has to push the diaphragm up into that space which is occupied by the lungs. And the way this works is by us squeezing our abdominal muscles, and this in turn squeezes the contents of the belly upwards. And it's the contents of the belly which pushes up on the diaphragm, and it enables the diaphragm to take on this heavily domed shape, which will then push air out at the top. The diaphragm in this process is not actually an active muscle. So the diaphragm is active when we're inspiring, and it's relaxed when we're expiring, and in fact it's the muscles of the abdomen which are squeezing on the contents of the belly, which push the relaxed diaphragm upwards, which pushes the air out of the top. The process is actually exactly the same as when you squeeze a tube of toothpaste at the bottom of the tube and toothpaste comes out at the top. The squeezing at the bottom displaces the contents at the bottom of the tube, which pushes up on the contents above it, which in turn pushes toothpaste out of the top. The way that we expire, push air out of ourselves, is exactly the same. And if you go to the website, if you go to the Wiki Week 2 page, you'll see a link to an MRI scan of a horn player, which shows very clearly how contraction of the abdominal muscles pushes air out of the top and enables her to play her horn. And these are the muscles which enable us to do that. These are the abdominal muscles, the muscles that cover the contents of the belly. In the middle, running up and down, you can see the rectus abdominis, and you can see that it's broken up into sections. It's got little white strips running horizontally across it. And the result of this is when you tense the rectus abdominis, the muscle part of it bunches up, and you get that sort of rippled effect on over your belly, which very fit, very active people get. Beneath the rectus abdominis, there are various bands of muscle running in various oblique directions, up and to the left, down and to the right, etc. And in fact, there's a strong muscle which runs a little bit like the Michelin man along your belly, sort of axially. And together, all these muscles, apart from giving you postural strength, they're the things which enable us to stand up and walk around and bend down and so forth. They're also the muscles which will contract the contents of the belly, push it upwards and push air out of the top. So these are the muscles, these are the primary muscles used for active expiration. There are other muscles used. The rib cage can contract a little bit around its side. We can move our shoulders up and down. But in terms of a strong expiratory push, it's the push with the abdominal muscles that really gets air out of the system, and in English will create stresses. This is the illustration of levels of prominence that you saw in the first of the Week 2 videos, and the green line is delimiting the major distinction which is made in English, that between unstressed syllables, which are above the green line, and stressed syllables, which are below the green line. And everything below the green line is made with a push, some sort of extra effort created largely by the abdominal muscles. Everything above the green line is made with no such push. The unstressed syllables are made on the remnants of the push made by the abdominal muscles or in anticipation of that push. So this is the primary distinction in English. It's the thing which most of all we work on with our students when we're starting to work with them on English pronunciation.